I never thought I'd spend Christmas Day plotting revenge against my own son, but life has a way of teaching you that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. My name is Rebecca. I'm 52 years old, and I live in a quiet suburb just outside of Manchester. For 28 years, I poured everything I had into raising my boy, Daniel. His father left when Daniel was just 3, disappearing one Tuesday morning with nothing but a note saying he couldn't handle being a parent. So it was just us, me and my beautiful baby boy against the world. I worked 2 jobs to put him through private school, went without new clothes for years so he could have piano lessons and football kits, and I never once made him feel like a burden. He was my entire world, my reason for breathing, and I genuinely believed we had the kind of bond that nothing could break. I was so incredibly wrong. The Christmas that destroyed everything started like any other. I'd been planning it for months, the way I always did, making sure every detail was perfect. I'd saved up from my job at the local library and my weekend shifts at the garden center to buy Daniel and his wife Emma the gifts they'd mentioned wanting throughout the year. A new espresso machine for their kitchen, those expensive wool blankets Emma had admired in John Lewis, a leather briefcase for Daniel's promotion at the accounting firm where he worked. I'd even bought gifts for my 2 grandchildren, Sophie, who was 5, and Thomas, who was 3, spending more than I should have on the toys they'd been asking Father Christmas for. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine. The tree was decorated with the same ornaments we'd used since Daniel was little, and I'd spent 2 full days preparing a traditional Christmas dinner with all the trimmings. They arrived around 11 in the morning on Christmas Day, and I noticed immediately that something felt off. Daniel barely hugged me when he walked through the door, and Emma's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The children seemed fine, excited about the presents under the tree, but there was a tension between the adults that I couldn't quite place. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe they'd had a row in the car on the way over. It happened to all couples, I reasoned, especially during the stress of the holidays. We opened presents, the kids squealed with delight, and I watched Daniel's face as he unwrapped the briefcase I'd chosen so carefully. He nodded and said thanks, but there was no real warmth in it, no recognition of the sacrifice behind that gift. Emma was slightly more enthusiastic about the blankets, but I caught her and Daniel exchanging a look I couldn't quite read. Dinner was ready by 2 o'clock, and we all sat down at the table I'd set with my grandmother's china, the pieces I only brought out for special occasions. I'd made turkey with sage and onion stuffing, roast potatoes crisped to perfection, honey-glazed parsnips, Brussels sprouts with chestnuts, homemade cranberry sauce, and my famous bread sauce that Daniel had always loved as a child. For dessert, I prepared both Christmas pudding and a chocolate log because I knew the children preferred chocolate. As we ate, I tried to make conversation, asking about Daniel's promotion, about the children's school nativity play, about their plans for the new year. The responses were short, almost clipped, and I started to feel a knot forming in my stomach. Then, just as I was clearing the main course plates, Daniel set down his wine glass and looked at Emma. She nodded slightly, and he turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Cold. Almost calculating. He said they needed to talk to me about something important, and my first thought was that Emma might be pregnant again. Maybe they were planning to move abroad for Daniel's work. I actually smiled, expecting news, expecting something that would require my support and love. What he said instead made the room spin. He told me they'd decided I could no longer be part of their lives the way I had been, that I was too involved, too overbearing, too controlling, that I'd been smothering him his entire life, and now I was doing the same to his children. Emma sat there nodding along, adding her own complaints about how I always had an opinion about their parenting choices, how I made her feel inadequate as a mother, how I'd never truly accepted her into the family. I stood there holding a stack of dirty plates, my grandmother's china that I'd lovingly washed and dried by hand for decades, and I couldn't process what I was hearing. Daniel said they'd been discussing it with a therapist, that they needed boundaries, that my constant need to be involved in every aspect of their lives was unhealthy. I tried to defend myself, my voice shaking, asking for specific examples of what I'd done wrong. I'd only ever tried to help, I said. When I'd offered to babysit, it was because I wanted to give them time together as a couple. When I'd suggested that Sophie might be wearing clothes too light for the winter weather, it was because I was worried about her catching cold. When I'd bought Thomas that educational toy instead of the violent video game he'd asked for, it was because I thought I was making a good choice as a grandmother. Daniel's response was like a slap across the face. He said I'd never respected him as an adult, never accepted that he was capable of making his own decisions, never stopped treating him like a child who needed constant guidance. The worst part was when he brought up the money. All those years of sacrifice, of going without, of working myself to exhaustion to give him opportunities I'd never had. He threw it all back in my face, saying I'd used it to control him, that I'd always made him feel guilty, that every gift came with invisible strings attached. He said I'd been keeping a ledger in my head his entire life, tallying up everything I'd done for him so I could use it as leverage to make him feel obligated to me. That wasn't true. It had never been about control. I'd done those things because I loved him, because seeing him happy and successful was the only reward I'd ever wanted. But as I stood there in my kitchen on Christmas Day, surrounded by the remnants of the perfect holiday I'd tried so hard to create, I realized that he genuinely believed what he was saying. Emma chimed in then, her voice saccharine sweet, but with an edge of steel underneath, saying they'd decided I could only see the grandchildren once a month, and only if I agreed to respect their rules and boundaries. No more dropping by unannounced. No more offering unsolicited advice. No more buying gifts without checking with them first. They'd be supervising all visits until they felt confident I could behave appropriately. I felt something crack inside my chest, a physical sensation like my heart was actually breaking. My grandchildren, the lights of my life, were being used as bargaining chips to force me into submission. Sophie looked confused. Thomas was playing with a toy car under the table, neither of them understanding that they were witnessing the moment their grandmother's world fell apart. I asked Daniel how he could do this to me, especially on Christmas Day, especially after everything we'd been through together. His response is something I'll never forget. He said Christmas Day was actually the perfect time, because maybe the shock of it would finally make me understand how serious they were, that they'd been trying to set boundaries for years, but I'd always found ways around them, always made them feel guilty, always played the victim. He said I'd manipulated him his entire life with guilt and obligation, and he was done. He was finally free. That word, free, as if I'd been his captor instead of his mother, as if loving him and supporting him and sacrificing everything for him had been some kind of imprisonment. They left shortly after that, gathering up the children and the presents and walking out of my house while I stood frozen in the doorway. I watched Daniel buckle Sophie into her car seat, watched Emma settle Thomas on her lap with his new stuffed animal, watched them drive away down the street lined with Christmas lights and festive decorations. Neighbors were probably inside their own homes, happy and warm, sharing love and laughter with their families. And I was standing there alone, my house full of uneaten Christmas pudding and unopened crackers, feeling like I'd just been erased from my own son's life. The worst part wasn't even the things he'd said. It was the relief I'd seen on his face as he walked out the door, as if he'd finally accomplished something he'd been planning for a long time. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room surrounded by Christmas decorations that now felt like a mockery, and I replayed every interaction I'd had with Daniel over the past few years. Had I really been overbearing? Had I really made him feel controlled? I'd always thought I was just being a good mother, staying involved, offering help when I saw they were struggling. When I'd noticed Sophie's coat was too thin for December weather, I bought her a warmer one. When I'd seen they were feeding the children fish fingers and chips 3 nights in a row, I'd made a big batch of my homemade cottage pie and dropped it round. When Emma had seemed stressed about going back to work after having Thomas, I'd offered to cut back my own hours to provide free childcare. These had all seemed like acts of love to me, acts of service, but Daniel had reframed every single one as proof of my controlling nature. By the time the sun came up on Boxing Day, I'd made a decision. If Daniel wanted to believe I was manipulative and controlling, if he wanted to cut me out of his life and use my grandchildren as leverage, then fine. I would show him what those words actually meant. I would take back every single thing I'd given him, every opportunity I'd created, every sacrifice I'd made. Not out of spite, I told myself then, though I know now that spite was absolutely part of it. But out of a need to prove a point. He wanted to be free of me. I'd make sure he understood exactly what being free of me actually cost. I started by calling my solicitor the day after Boxing Day. Her name was Patricia, and I'd used her services years ago when I bought my house. I explained the situation, leaving out the emotional devastation and focusing on the facts. I'd given Daniel substantial financial support over the years, I told her. I'd paid for his private school education, his university tuition, his master's degree. When he and Emma had bought their first house 6 years ago, I'd given them £30,000 for the deposit, money I'd inherited from my own mother's estate. That money had been given as a gift, Patricia said, and gifts generally couldn't be reclaimed. But, she added thoughtfully, there might be other avenues to explore depending on what I wanted to achieve. What I wanted was complicated. Part of me wanted to hurt Daniel the way he'd hurt me, wanted to make him feel even a fraction of the pain I was experiencing. But another part of me, the part that had been his mother for 28 years, just wanted him to understand what he'd done. Wanted him to recognize the value of everything I'd provided, everything I'd sacrificed. Patricia asked if there had been any formal agreements regarding financial support, any loans or contracts. I told her no, it had all been informal, family helping family. She was quiet for a moment, then asked about the house I was currently living in. Did I have a will? Who was the beneficiary? I'd made my will 10 years earlier, shortly after Daniel had graduated from university. Everything I owned, the house I'd worked 2 jobs to pay off, my savings, my pension, was all going to him. It had seemed natural at the time, obvious even. He was my only child, my only family. Who else would I leave it to? Patricia suggested that perhaps I might want to reconsider those arrangements. She said it carefully, professionally, but I could hear what she was really saying. I had leverage. My son had cut me off from his life and from my grandchildren, but I still controlled something he wanted. My estate wasn't enormous. The house was probably worth around £300,000, and I had maybe $50,000 in savings. But to Daniel and Emma, who were always complaining about money and struggling with their mortgage, it represented security. It represented their children's future. Over the next few weeks, I did something I'd never done before. I investigated my own son's life. I created a fake Facebook account and started following Emma's social media, going through years of posts I'd never seen before. She was far more active online than I'd realized, constantly posting about their lives, their struggles, their triumphs. And as I scrolled back through the years, I started to see a pattern that made my blood run cold. Posts about how hard it was to deal with overbearing in-laws, jokes about mothers-in-law who couldn't let go, memes about toxic family relationships, comments from her friends sympathizing with her situation, telling her she needed to set boundaries, that she didn't owe anything to people who made her feel bad about herself. Going back even further, I found posts from before Sophie was born, when Daniel and Emma were newlyweds. Posts about their wedding that I'd helped pay for, contributing £10,000 because Emma's parents were retired and on a fixed income. In those early posts, Emma had seemed genuinely grateful, posting photos of the wedding with captions about how blessed they were to have such supportive family. But something had shifted around the time Sophie was born. The posts became more pointed, more negative, references to people who thought they knew better than the actual parents, complaints about unwanted advice. It was clear that Emma had been building a narrative about me for years, positioning me as the villain in their story. And Daniel had apparently believed every word. I found something else, too. Something that made me realize just how calculated their Christmas Day ambush had been. 3 months before Christmas, Emma had posted about a therapy session where they'd discussed family dynamics. She'd written about how liberating it felt to finally name the toxic patterns in her life, how supported she felt by her therapist in setting boundaries. The comments on that post were full of people cheering her on, telling her she was brave, that she deserved to protect her peace. No one in that comment section knew me, knew my side of things, knew how many nights I'd stayed awake worrying about whether Daniel had enough money for groceries when he was at university. They just knew Emma's version, where I was the overbearing mother-in-law who needed to be managed and controlled. I started making phone calls to other family members, people I hadn't spoken to in years. My sister Helen, who lived in Scotland, and who I'd drifted apart from over time. My cousin Margaret, who'd always been closer to me before I'd gotten so wrapped up in raising Daniel. As I talked to them, telling them what had happened, I started to hear their perspectives on my relationship with my son. And I didn't like what I heard. Helen gently suggested that maybe I had been a bit too focused on Daniel over the years, that I'd let my entire identity become wrapped up in being his mother. Margaret mentioned that she'd always felt like I wasn't really interested in her life, that every conversation we had always circled back to Daniel's achievements and problems. It was hard to hear, but I forced myself to listen. Had I really been that consumed by motherhood? Looking back honestly, I realized that I probably had. After Daniel's father left, I'd thrown myself into parenting with an intensity that might have been unhealthy. I'd had no hobbies, no real friends, no life outside of my son. When he'd gone to university, I felt lost, purposeless. When he'd gotten married, I felt like I was losing him. And when Sophie and Thomas were born, I desperately tried to make myself essential to their lives, perhaps because I was terrified of being alone. But recognizing that I might have made mistakes didn't mean I deserved what Daniel had done to me. It didn't mean the way he'd handled it was right, and it certainly didn't mean I was going to just accept being cut out of his life without consequence. I changed my will in January, leaving everything to a children's charity instead of to Daniel. Patricia drafted it carefully, making sure it was legally sound and couldn't be contested. I didn't tell Daniel about the change. That information would come later, when it could do the most damage. But changing the will wasn't enough. I wanted Daniel to understand what he'd lost, wanted him to feel the absence of my support, the way I was feeling the absence of my grandchildren. So I started looking into other ways I'd been helping them financially, quietly and without making a fuss about it. For the past 3 years, I've been paying for Sophie's ballet lessons, £100 a month, that I'd been transferring directly to the dance school. I called them and canceled the standing order, explaining that I'd no longer be covering the costs. Within a week, Emma posted on Facebook about how disappointed Sophie was that she'd have to quit ballet because they couldn't afford it anymore. She didn't mention that I'd been the one paying for it all along. I'd also been buying all the children's birthday and Christmas presents from me, but also secretly funding the bigger presents that supposedly came from Daniel and Emma. The bicycle Sophie got for her 4th birthday, the play kitchen Thomas got for his 2nd Christmas. I'd been the one paying for those, letting Daniel take the credit. That stopped immediately. In February, I found out that Daniel had applied for a promotion at his firm, a senior position that would come with a significant pay rise. He'd listed me as a character reference on his application, probably without even thinking about it, probably assuming I'd give him a glowing recommendation the way I always had. When the HR department called me, I was honest, completely, brutally honest. I told them that Daniel was intelligent and capable, that he had strong analytical skills, that he was good at his job. But I also told them that he had difficulty maintaining long-term relationships, that he could be cold and calculating when it served his purposes, that he'd recently demonstrated a concerning lack of loyalty to people who'd supported him. I said it all in a calm, professional tone, never raising my voice, never making it sound emotional or personal. Just facts. Just observations from someone who'd known him his entire life. He didn't get the promotion. I heard about it through Margaret, who'd heard about it through her daughter who worked in the same office building. Daniel had been devastated, apparently, convinced that he'd been the obvious choice for the position. He'd complained to Emma that the decision didn't make sense, that his interview had gone well, that he couldn't understand what had gone wrong. I felt a small, dark satisfaction knowing that I'd played a role in that disappointment. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to balance the scales, but it was a start. Around the same time, I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, helping women who were rebuilding their lives after difficult relationships. It gave me a sense of purpose I'd been lacking, and it also gave me perspective. These women had been through genuine abuse, real trauma, and they were showing incredible strength in moving forward. My situation was different, but I learned from them. I learned about documentation, about building a case, about the importance of evidence. I learned that revenge didn't have to be loud or violent. It could be quiet, methodical, strategic. It could be about taking back your power one careful step at a time. I also started seeing a therapist of my own, a woman named Dr. Sharma, who specialized in family estrangement. I was honest with her about what I was doing, about the steps I was taking to hurt Daniel financially and professionally. I expected her to tell me to stop, to say I was being vindictive and cruel. Instead, she asked me why I felt the need for revenge, what I hoped to achieve. And as I talked it through with her over several sessions, I realized that it wasn't really about hurting Daniel. It was about showing him that actions have consequences, that you can't just erase someone from your life without cost, that the people who love you and support you deserve basic respect and gratitude. Dr. Sharma helped me see that what Daniel had done to me on Christmas Day was emotionally abusive. He'd deliberately chosen a day that was supposed to be about family and love to deliver devastating news, maximizing the impact and the hurt. He'd refused to give me any chance to defend myself or to discuss the issues before making his decision. He'd used my grandchildren as leverage, knowing that threatening my access to them would cause me immense pain. And he'd reframed my entire history of love and sacrifice as something sinister and controlling, invalidating decades of genuine care. Recognizing it as abuse didn't make it hurt less, but it did make me feel less guilty about fighting back. In March, I discovered something that changed everything. I'd been going through old boxes in my attic, looking for some documents Patricia needed for the will changes, when I found a folder of papers from when Daniel was at university. There were his student loan documents, and as I read through them, something caught my eye. When Daniel had applied for student finance, you had to declare your parents' income. The amount of loan and grant you received was means-tested, based on what your parents supposedly could afford to contribute. I'd always known this, had always been honest on the forms, declaring my income from both my jobs. But what I'd forgotten until I saw these papers again was exactly how much I'd been expected to contribute according to the student finance calculations. The expected parental contribution had been almost nothing, maybe £1,000 a year, because my income was relatively low, but I'd contributed far more than that. I'd been paying Daniel's rent, his food costs, his travel expenses, buying his textbooks, giving him spending money. I'd been giving him at least £15,000 a year on top of his student loan, money I'd saved and scraped together by working extra shifts and cutting every possible expense from my own life. And he'd let me. He'd never told me I didn't need to give him so much, never suggested that he could manage on his student loan and a part-time job like most of his friends did. He'd just taken the money, spent it, and apparently built up resentment about how it made him feel obligated to me. The student finance papers also showed that Daniel had taken out the maximum loan amount, which meant he should have been graduating with around £30,000 of debt. But I knew he'd graduated debt-free because I'd given him the money to pay off the loans early, another £15,000 from my mother's inheritance, the same inheritance I'd later used for his house deposit. I sat on the attic floor surrounded by old boxes and papers, and I did the math. Over the course of his education, from private school fees to university support to loan repayments, I'd spent over £200,000 on Daniel. Money I'd earned through years of exhausting work, through sacrificing my own comfort and security. Money that could have been used for my own retirement, for traveling, for enjoying my life. And my son had taken all of it, benefited from all of it, built his entire comfortable middle-class existence on the foundation of my sacrifice, and then had the audacity to accuse me of using money to control him. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The ingratitude was staggering. I made copies of everything, every receipt I could find, every bank statement showing transfers to Daniel, every piece of documentation proving what I'd given him over the years. Patricia had said gifts couldn't be reclaimed, but I wasn't trying to reclaim them. I was building a different kind of case. I was building evidence of his character, proof that could be used in other ways. Because I'd realized something sitting in that attic. Daniel had been rewriting history, telling himself a story where he was the victim of a controlling mother, when the truth was that he'd been the beneficiary of extraordinary generosity that he'd never properly acknowledged or appreciated. And if he could lie to himself so thoroughly about our past, what else might he be lying about? I started digging deeper into Daniel and Emma's finances, not through any illegal means, but through simple observation and the information they made public. Emma's Facebook posts were a goldmine. She complained constantly about money problems, about how unfair it was that they couldn't afford the lifestyle they wanted, about how they were always struggling despite Daniel having a good job. But her posts also showed a different picture. Regular meals out at expensive restaurants, a family holiday to Spain, new furniture for the living room, designer clothes for the children, a brand new car for Emma. These weren't the financial choices of people who were genuinely struggling. These were the choices of people who were living beyond their means and then complaining about the natural consequences. I also noticed that they'd started a crowdfunding page for Sophie's school trip to France, asking friends and family to contribute because they couldn't afford the cost. This was a child whose grandmother had paid for her ballet lessons for 3 years, whose grandmother had funded countless birthday presents and Christmas gifts, whose grandmother had contributed £30,000 to her parents' house deposit. But now that grandmother had been cut off, the money had dried up, and suddenly they needed to beg on the internet for help. Part of me wanted to comment on the crowdfunding page, wanted to explain to all their friends exactly why Daniel and Emma were suddenly so skint. But I held back. That would be too obvious, too emotional. What I was doing needed to be more subtle, more strategic. Instead, I made a small, anonymous donation to the crowdfunding page, with a comment that said something like, "Hope Sophie has a wonderful trip. It's so important to invest in children's education and experiences." It was petty. I knew it was petty. But seeing that comment sit there among the others, knowing that Daniel and Emma would read it and possibly wonder if it was from me, gave me a small thrill of satisfaction. I was making sure they felt my absence in 1,000 small ways, making sure they understood what they'd given up when they'd decided to cut me out of their lives. In April, I got a call from the primary school that Sophie attended. They were organizing a grandparents' day, and they'd sent home letters asking if grandparents could come in to talk to the children about what life was like when they were young. Apparently, Sophie had given them my contact information, probably from memory or from before Christmas when she'd still been allowed to spend time with me. The teacher on the phone was lovely, explaining that Sophie had been very excited about the possibility of me coming, that she'd told all her friends about her grandmother who used to take her to the library and read her stories. My heart broke and soared at the same time. Sophie remembered me. Sophie wanted me there. But I knew that Daniel and Emma would never allow it. I thanked the teacher and explained that I probably wouldn't be able to attend due to family circumstances. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that made me realize she knew more than she was letting on. She mentioned that Sophie had seemed quite sad lately, that she'd been asking about me, saying she missed her Nana. The teacher said it carefully, professionally, not overstepping any boundaries, but clearly wanting me to know that my granddaughter was hurting. I thanked her again and hung up, then sat and cried for the first time since Christmas Day. Not for myself, but for Sophie, who was an innocent victim in all of this. For Thomas, who was probably too young to fully understand why he didn't see his Nana anymore. For the relationship I was losing with them through no fault of my own. That phone call crystallized something for me. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for my grandchildren, for their right to know me, for their right to benefit from having a grandmother who loved them. Daniel and Emma were using the children as weapons, punishing me by withholding access to them. But in doing so, they were also punishing Sophie and Thomas. They were depriving them of family connections, of experiences, of the kind of unconditional love that only a grandparent can provide. And that wasn't just cruel to me. It was cruel to the children. I started documenting everything related to the children. The teacher's phone call, the fact that Sophie had asked for me specifically for Grandparents' Day. I made notes about every birthday and Christmas that passed without me being allowed to see them. about every school event I was excluded from. Patricia had mentioned something in one of our earlier conversations about grandparents' rights, about how in some circumstances, grandparents could apply for access through the courts if they'd had a significant relationship with the children that was being unfairly denied. I'd dismissed it at the time, not wanting to go to war with my own son in a courtroom. But now, I was reconsidering. Now I was thinking about what would be best for Sophie and Thomas, not just what would be easiest for me. In May, something happened that showed me just how effective my quiet campaign of consequences had been. Emma's Facebook posts became increasingly desperate. Complaints about money intensified. References to feeling unsupported by family. Vague posts about people not being who you thought they were. And then, one evening, a post that was clearly about me even though I wasn't named. It talked about cutting toxic people out of your life and how liberating it was, but also how frustrating it was when those toxic people had been providing financial support that you didn't even realize you'd been depending on. The comments on that post were fascinating. Some people supported Emma, telling her she was better off without toxic influences regardless of the financial cost. But others were more skeptical, asking what kind of support she'd been receiving, suggesting that maybe she needed to reevaluate whether someone who'd been helping her financially was really toxic, or whether she'd just taken them for granted. One commenter, someone named Fiona, who seemed to be an old friend of Emma's, wrote something particularly interesting. She said she remembered Emma talking about how helpful Daniel's mom had been when Sophie was born, how she'd been doing free babysitting and bringing round home-cooked meals, and basically being exactly the kind of grandmother every parent dreams of. Fiona asked what had changed, whether Daniel's mom had actually become controlling, or whether the problem was that Emma had started to resent accepting help. The comment was deleted within an hour, but I'd screenshot it before it disappeared. It was evidence that even Emma's own friends could see the truth of the situation, could see that perhaps the problem wasn't as simple as Emma and Daniel had been presenting it. Around this time, I also learned through Margaret's network that Daniel had been complaining at work about financial stress. He'd been seen looking at the salary information for the promotion he'd missed out on, doing calculations on his phone during lunch breaks, clearly working out what the extra money would have meant for his family's budget. His colleagues had started to notice that he was bringing packed lunches instead of buying food from the cafeteria, that he was cutting back on the rounds of drinks after work, that he seemed generally stressed about money. Good, I thought. Let him feel the pressure. Let him understand that my support hadn't been about control. It had been about love, about making his life easier, about wanting him to be comfortable and secure. In June, I took a step that I knew was potentially crossing a line, but I did it anyway. I wrote a letter to Emma's parents, Donald and Patricia, who I'd always gotten along well with before the Christmas Day disaster. In a letter, I explained what had happened from my perspective. I didn't badmouth their daughter, didn't call her names or make accusations. I simply laid out the facts. The financial support I'd provided over the years, the way I'd been cut off without warning, the way I was being denied access to my grandchildren. I said I was confused and hurt, and I was reaching out to them because I hoped they might be able to offer some insight into what I'd done wrong, or perhaps mediate a conversation where Daniel and Emma and I could work through our differences. The response I got was not what I expected. Donald called me 2 weeks later, and he sounded uncomfortable but also sympathetic. He said that Emma had told them about the situation, but her version had been quite different from mine. In her version, I'd been boundary stomping for years, refusing to respect their parenting choices, making Emma feel inadequate, and generally making their lives miserable. But Donald said that he and Patricia had been talking, and some things weren't adding up. Emma had mentioned that money was tight because they'd lost some family financial support, and when Donald had asked what support she meant, Emma had been vague and changed the subject. Donald said he'd always thought I was a generous and kind person, that he'd appreciated how I'd helped with the wedding costs, and he was having trouble reconciling the person he knew with the villain Emma was describing. I thanked Donald for his honesty and told him I appreciated him taking the time to call. I said I understood that he was in a difficult position, that Emma was his daughter and of course he needed to support her. But I also said that I hoped he'd keep an open mind, and if he ever wanted to know more details about the financial support I'd provided, I'd be happy to share documentation. He was quiet for a moment, then said something that gave me hope. He said that when his own parents had been alive, they'd been very involved with Emma's life, helping out financially and with childcare, and Emma had always spoken about them with love and gratitude. He found it strange that she was now framing similar help from me as toxic and controlling. He said he'd think about everything I'd told him, and that maybe he'd have a conversation with Emma about being fairer to me. That phone call was a turning point. I realized that I didn't have to fight this battle alone. There were other people who could see the truth, who could potentially influence Daniel and Emma, who could apply pressure from different angles. I started reaching out to other people in their lives, carefully and strategically. Not to trash talk them or turn people against them, but simply to tell my side of the story, to plant seeds of doubt about the narrative they'd been spreading. Daniel's best friend from university, Marcus, who I'd always gotten along well with. Emma's sister, Charlotte, who had children of her own and who I thought might understand the pain of being separated from grandchildren. Daniel's godmother, my old friend Judith, who'd known him since he was a baby. Each conversation was carefully calibrated. I never badmouthed Daniel or Emma. I never made demands or asked people to take sides. I simply shared what had happened, expressed my confusion and hurt, and asked if they had any insight that might help me understand. And slowly, over the course of several weeks, I started to hear back. Marcus called me to say he'd tried to talk to Daniel about the situation, and Daniel had become defensive and angry, refusing to discuss it. That was apparently out of character for Daniel, who usually loved to analyze and discuss problems in detail. Marcus said it made him wonder if Daniel knew, on some level, that his position didn't hold up to scrutiny. Charlotte had a more direct approach. She'd apparently confronted Emma at a family barbecue, asking her how she could justify cutting off a grandmother who'd been nothing but supportive. Emma had said it was complicated, that I'd been manipulative in ways that were hard to explain. Charlotte had pushed back, asking for specific examples, and Emma had struggled to provide them. Everything she'd cited, being offered babysitting, receiving home-cooked meals, getting help with the children, these were all things that Charlotte herself appreciated from her own mother. She'd told Emma that it sounded like she was punishing me for being helpful, and Emma had gotten upset and left the barbecue early. Judith's response was perhaps the most valuable. She'd known me for over 30 years, had been there when Daniel was born, had watched me raise him as a single mother. She'd also known Daniel's father, had seen firsthand how devastated I'd been when he'd left. Judith called me and said she'd been thinking about the situation a lot since we'd talked, and she'd come to a realization. She said that Daniel had always been slightly ashamed of his background, of having a single mother who worked as a librarian, of not having the kind of wealthy, two-parent family that many of his private school classmates had. She thought that now Daniel had achieved a certain level of middle-class respectability, he was rewriting his history to make himself feel better about where he'd come from. Casting me as controlling and overbearing meant he could frame his success as something he'd achieved despite me, rather than because of me. That observation hit hard because it rang true. Daniel had always been slightly self-conscious about our circumstances. When his friends' parents would pick them up in expensive cars, Daniel would ask me to.